Everyone has heard of King John, the tyrant forced to go to war with his barons, leading to the signing of the Magna Carta. People probably know him from Robin Hood or other Hollywood productions, but I'm not here to delve into the realms of mythology, hearsay or legend. My mission is to unveil the man behind the myth. Who was King John? At last, a peace treaty between the barons and the king has been signed, known today as the Magna Carta. More than just a peace treaty, political reform. Change for everyone, both servile and free. At Runnymede, on the 19th of June, the barons, knowing the king respects their will, pledge allegiance once again. But the king has no intention of ever obeying the 63 clauses of the now famous document. The bugger is, the charter was always in flux, incomplete. The king even rushed in to block several other amendments before the ink touched parchment. The biggest problem was that the Magna Carta was extorted by force, which alone made it an illegal document. The rebels had attempted to work around this with two mechanisms. Clause 52 basically hinted at the 25 barons, who would oversee the king, further mentioned in Clause 61. They were in whether the king liked it or not, regardless of his trying to block it at the last minute. The 25 Magnes, all rebels, they now held the leash over the king, and they were clinging to this. Yes, John had tried to block it, but they had already weaseled their way in. The 25 set themselves up in London, working to implement the rules of the Charter, and Magna Carta isn't going to be a single legal document binding the king. No, it'll take several attempts, reissues and rewrites, before it becomes the near mythical document as we see it today. Of the original document, only 4 copies survive. Only a dozen or more were ever written. Right now, in 1215, it is a step forward, but a step too far, pushed by an ever-progressive faction of Magnes, who smelled blood. They knew they could push this further. The king's enemies were writing the rules. They were destabilising the sovereignty of the king. The Magna Carta itself was the architect of their own ruin. So this was a peace treaty, nothing less. But Articles 52 and 61 made it a manifesto for war. So despite all this, and all the agreements, and even the king's seal, the charter meant very little. It still required a compliant king, and compliant Magnes. John was the very opposite of compliant. So naturally, the barons, led by Robert Fitzwalter, highly suspicious of the king, were also non-compliant. But the rebels still held some strong cards. They still had London. They still held the treasury. They promised to take the royal castles one by one, but the table was tipped in their favour. There were a lot of grudges simmering here, and the 25 was certainly ramping up the pressure. The king had eventually agreed to the 25, and before long, 12 knights would be elected in each county to effectively carry this out. The deliberations lasted around a week from when the Magna Carta was signed. So at least the king was compliant so far. Grievances were being readdressed. And even the Flemish mercenaries were sent home. There was no need for them. And the talks at Runnymede took until the 23rd of June, most of the month. Finally, after this, the meetings were adjourned. But like I said before, the king had no intention of ever being compliant. It was all a ruse. Apparently, when away from the barons, he'd roll his eyes and gnash his teeth in rage. So upon leaving Runnymede, he headed straight for Winchester. From there, he passed through Wiltshire on his way to Marlborough Castle, grabbing all the coin from Marlborough and Devizes, the roaming treasury, once run by Peter de Roche. Then, the old John begins to resurface. Oh, he'll obey the charter, yes. He promised to obey the charter, to the letter. So, John moves upon Geoffrey Martigny. The demand for him to surrender Northampton Castle. After all, he was a Frenchman. Magna Carta was banning foreigners from office, after all. So, he made Geoffrey Martigny an offer. Leave office and join John. But the barons expected this, and looking at events, something was clearly going on behind the scenes. They were organising a series of tournaments all over the kingdom. That way, they could technically be armed for war at all times. Well, clever, actually. One particular tournament in Stanford was rescheduled and moved to Staines, just outside of London. They clearly thought that John was up to something, possibly even assault the capital. So they just happened to have armed soldiers in the area. A tournament? The seams were already unravelling now for the Magna Carta. And in the north, rebels began putting John's lands to ruin. Less than a month later, they all met at Oxford, with the two factions, royal and baronial. Even Welsh, headed by none other than Llewellyn the Great. More arguments started. John wants peace in the north, as well as a written document of fealty. But the barons simply told him where to go. The Oxford Conference was going nowhere fast. And so it begins. Thus sounded the horns for war. Thus began the fortifying of castles. Thus ended the treaty. John issues demands to the northern barons, cease and desist, return everything they've stolen. But no one was listening, so John puts his faith in all those that had proven loyal. Not the northern rebels, not the Londoners, his Flemish mercenaries, only a coin away, his allies that still remained in Poitou, and the Pope himself, Innocent III, Vicar of Rome. Thus the Magna Carta was doomed. The bishops had already seen calamity. They had tried to make sense of this, led by Stephen Langton. They tried their utmost best, but the two factions were determined to fight. Langton persuaded the two to meet again in Oxford in mid-August, and the barons were there, again dressed for battle. But this time, John had letters from Rome. Hugh de Beauvoir, a Frenchman in exile, has crossed into England and produces these letters, apparently from the Pope, which the king then proudly has broadcast from pulpits all over the kingdom. John wants all military aid to come to England, and allegedly all sins will be forgiven. Ralph of Coggeshal, the chronicler, speculates whether these letters were forgeries or not, a ploy by the king who was attempting to get the Magna Carta declared null and void. Either way, it was taken very seriously, and the Pope certainly didn't claim they were forged. Though, at this point, Innocent wasn't remotely aware of the Magna Carta. His focus was on the unruly baronial rebels. This is about to get a lot worse. After all, John was the Pope's golden boy, who'd taken crusade. He'd taken the cross, like his brother Richard, crusading king. So naturally, the Pope declared the baronial rebels worse than Saracens. Innocent even opposed Stephen Langton, the cardinal he himself installed as Archbishop of Canterbury. Langton had failed to quell this silliness, therefore the Pope had quarrelled with him. All that supported this rebellion were to be excommunicated. All bishops that failed to adhere this papal bull removed from office. There, settled, matter over, done, dusted. Except, no, it wasn't. In an odd display for the 13th century, the Pope had no power here. The bishops deliberated, plotted, while the king made plans to leave England. Again, Runnymede. Langton was pushing this. Peace, not war. Peace. But the king was in Dorset, setting sail, and here no two sources understand just where John was headed. We only know that the king abandoned the kingdom. I'm not kidding. Meanwhile, the bishops conducted affairs at Runnymede, for all the worth, the excommunication looming over the gathering. But it could be argued both ways. From the Pope's letter, as it is written, "Disturbers of the king and kingdom." It looks like quite a bit of wiggle room here. Arguably, in the eyes of the barons, John was the one that fitted this description. Disturbers of the king and kingdom. Not the barons. Before long they were in London. Without a king, they were dividing the kingdom up between themselves and heading off on their own affairs. Robert Fitzwater had claimed Northamptonshire, John de Lacy, Yorkshire, etc. With the king gone, they needed a new ruler and elected themselves to do it. But they shouldn't have been too hasty, for John wasn't too far away, it seems, and he wasn't going to interrupt his enemies when they were committing themselves to error. He'd seemingly been keeping a close eye on the barons, watching their moves, and apparently now was his time to strike. So wherever he was before, remember we don't know, he appears and lands in Sandwich, Kent. Then in Dover in September. While away, John has also to meet up with the papal legate, Pandulf, and with him was Peter de Roche, and on the 5th of September, according to the Pope's decree, the rebels were excommunicated. More, the Magna Carta was declared null and void. War was on. As enemies of the king, and no doubt fearing they'd suffer much worse than William de Brosse, the baronial rebels did something rather rash. They turned to none other than Philip Augustus of France. Oh, John must have seen the irony. Only 20 years ago, the tables were turned. There was another king on the throne, his brother, and John was making the deal with Philip, his patch from hell. Philip of France was more than willing, and announced that his son Louis, the Dauphin, would become the new king of England. Then Louis began to amass a great army in order to invade England. A quick thing, though, I must mention. I will refer to Louis as the Dauphin, i.e. heir to the French throne. Now, historically, the Dauphin came later, but it is a term I will use to describe the heir apparent to the French throne. In the same way, we call heir apparents of England as prince, despite the term coming much later. Edward II was only the Prince of Wales, and the first heir apparent wasn't called prince until the Georgian era. There you go. However, a Dauphin is simpler than saying French prince, as it might be mistaken for a certain chap in Bel Air. Dauphin it is. And the Dauphin is married to John's niece, Blanche of Castile, a formidable woman of the era, the French equivalent of Eleanor of Aquitaine. This gave the French legitimacy to the English throne, and Louis was preparing to invade England. to wrest his crown. The last proper invasion being in 1066, but unlike 1066, the French were defying the Pope. John clearly needed to be replaced, and the majority of the English barons not only supported but called for a French invasion. This was huge. A possible turning point in European history, the Capitals of France ruling England? Surely we would have read about this at school. The French invasion. Let's carry on, shall we? John begins by distributing castles to anyone who could hold them. Ranulph de Blondeville and the Marshal benefit greatly from this, the Marshal having spent most of the summer overseeing the defence of Wales, suffering great losses in Pembrokeshire. By autumn, the Marshal is waiting on the border, while John used his Flemish mercenaries, possibly led by Robert Bethune, a young nobleman from Flanders. The king has now secured both the north and the southwest. Meanwhile, some of the barons, led by Robert Fitzwalter, battened down the hatches in Rochester Castle, controlled by Stephen Langton. Highly defendable, a stronghold. The John was no doubt going to march on to London, so this was their best bet, and the Castellan was Reginald de Cornhill, an ally, and he opened the gates and let the rebels in. About Rochester and its importance, it is a formidable castle situated on the Medway, the river dividing Kent's north and south. It's Medway. It's on the road between London and Dover, blocking the route through. Rochester Castle is the Chateau Gaillard of England. Another demon from John's past come to haunt him. He'd tried to obtain it, but no luck. It was traditionally held by the archbishops, but Langton had refused to part with it. John even tried using laws from Henry I, the irony, but now it was in the hands of his enemies. Reginald de Cornhill held it for Langton, and now he held it for the rebels of Fitzwalter and his holy army. Naturally, John loses his rag. He orders Fitzwalter's land seized, but there is little he can do. His best bet is to send Pandulf, who is still there, to treat with Langton. Bugger is, Langton was heading for Rome. Hence, Cornhill was in charge. A lot of bishops were with Langton. They'd had enough. They weren't opposing the Charter, nor were they willing to oppose the Pope, hence heading to Rome. Pandulf managed to intercept the Archbishop of Canterbury before he pressed on further. He may have gotten as far as France, at the very least Dover, and the Papal legate suspended Stephen Langton from office right there and then. To put it bluntly, Langton had one job: excommunicate the rebels and annul the Magna Carta. He did not, but probably only because he had hope. He was more likely heading to Rome to explain the situation. Alas, no more. John and his supporters denounced Langton of being a fraud, accusing him of treason. The king demanded Rochester Castle, but the stubborn archbishop refused to comply. And besides, even if he did comply, he had little control over the baronial rebels who now held the castle. With the archbishop out the way, John turned his gaze to London, the metropolis capital of England. So John moved his forces from Dover to Canterbury, and then branches out to fortify castles. But Fitzwalter is also on the move, and John races back to Canterbury. Another game of chess. A game John is very familiar with, a game he was determined to win. These were an old opponent. He knew their every move. But while John was probably testing the waters, Fitzwalter most likely saw it as a military advance. His forces retreated back to Rochester, neither drawing blood. From Canterbury, John nudges his forces forward to the North Downs. He splits his forces into two. Some are to arrive at the upper Medway at Allington, and the others straight to Rochester itself. Another ironic point for John. He was now picking apart a puzzle, as Philip did at Weir, and like at Weir, there was a bridge. He no doubt wanted the Medway Bridge burned. Cut the castle off from London. But Fitzwalter managed to fend off the attackers. Again, with the two sides squared off, round 3. But a storm rages in September, scuppering several warships of John's Flemish mercenaries. Those that survived the storm made their way to Canterbury. Others didn't fare so well, and bodies apparently washed up on the shores.
Robert Bethune must have been in this fleet, and must have survived this brush with fate.
By October, the survivors were in great number, heading for Rochester. Full frontal attack, the only strategy left. Fitzwalter, realising he couldn't properly defend Rochester Castle, he puts William de Albini in charge of defending the inevitable leaguer, and races off for London. De Albini's garrison at Rochester is just over 100 dedicated veteran knights, hand-picked elites. There was no time to restock or rearm, as the armies of King John were upon them. The siege of Rochester had begun. De Albini knew he did not stand a chance, so gathered supplies in the city itself, but there was no way he could hold the walls. They soon fell, the king's men having broken through the gates, chased them through the streets. They would no doubt have preferred to flee for London, but John had by now destroyed the bridge that crossed the Medway. Instead, William de Albini retreated back to the castle, the keep. Just over 100 men versus an army. While the king's army settled down for siege, John once again proved his contempt for the church, as he occupied Rochester Cathedral, appallingly using it as a stables for his horses, as far as the high altar.
The cathedral was looted, and Wendover, in the Flores Historiarum, claims that not a penny remained with the body of Christ.
Huge trebuchets were erected to pound the castle's walls with stone. Day and night the onslaught continued.
2 weeks into the siege,
Robert Fitzwalter heads out from London with a relief force of 700 men, probably not knowing the Medway Bridge had been destroyed. Unfortunately, at Dartford, Fitzwalter hears the king's army had grown greatly in number. The king's foreign mercenaries were swarming all over Kent, gathering supplies for the siege. Fitzwalter had no choice but to head back to London. So in Rochester, de Albini was buggered. What was left of his 100 men were all there was to fend off John's growing army. The weeks raged on, and still they refused to surrender, with the walls standing firm. So John decides to undermine the walls. He orders pickaxes from Canterbury. The king manages to break through the inner curtain, forcing de Albini and his men back to the keep. By late November, the keep was undermined, and Hubert de Burgh was ordered to find 40 of the fattest pigs that were to be burned under the high tower. The wooden props that were holding up the mine burned with the pig fat, and the tower collapsed like a house of cards. Still, Albini fought the long defeat, refusing to surrender, using a cross wall as a last line of defence. But alas, provisions were exhausted and morale was at rock bottom. They had been reduced to eating their own war horses. De Albini sends out the less warlike of his men, but John responds by chopping off their hands and feet, an appalling punishment. On the 30th of November, Albini finally surrendered. They had lasted 7 whole weeks. 100 men against the king's vast army. The Crowland chronicler explains, "A living memory does not recall a siege so fiercely pressed and so staunchly resisted." And the plaque was erected to honour the 40 pigs, the man of the match. But with de Albini, John was in no mood for mercy. The king's nobles had to persuade him not to hang the entire garrison there and then, so John hangs only one, a crossbowman who had been brought up in the royal household. The rest were slung in prisons, and Albany sent to Corfe Castle. The other rebels felt a panic upon hearing this, fleeing to London or hiding in churches. The rebellion was over, time to mop up, and John was on the rampage, from Rochester to Winchester, then to St Albans. Here the king holds a war council. After deliberation, John splits his army into two, as Philip had done the year before. One battle would be commanded by William Longsby in the south, dealing with London and the rebels there. The second battle was commanded by John himself, and headed north, dealing with the rest, including the 16-year-old Scottish king Alexander II. The young scallywag had sided with Eustace de Vesey and other rebels. Like his father, Alexander laid claim to Northumbria. Upon de Vesey's homage to the Scottish king, Alexander had given him a special staff of office. So John set out for war. In November, there is another development going on in Rome. The Fourth Lateran Council. Here the movers and shakers in the Vatican meet to discuss various religious affairs, mainly sacraments and topics like simony, but also heresy and crusade. After all, Pope Innocent III really wants the Fifth Crusade underway, in another bid to wrest the Holy Land from the Saracens. It is also the council that pretty much paved the way for anti-Semitism in Europe as we know it. Yes, it had already been going on for several centuries by now, especially in the Arabic world where non-Muslims had to wear certain marks, but that was about to take a nasty turn. Here, the familiar yellow badges became mandatory, and every Jew was demanded to wear one. Badges that would also rear their ugly head during the Holocaust. But it wasn't just the Jews, but Muslims in Europe were also suffering under the Fourth Lateran Council. They also had to wear badges, so Christians could avoid accidental contact with people of other religions. Also, something else came out of this: excommunication. As it is said that all of the baronial rebels in England, as well as Louis the Dauphin of France, were excommunicated, just in case they hadn't already got the memo. John must have rubbed his hands in glee. Wendover doesn't paint John in a good light here. He intended to destroy everything that came his way with fire and sword. Leaving St Albans, he spends Christmas in Nottingham, geared for war. In the south was mayhem. Longsby was busy containing the rebels in London and surrounding areas, aided by the forces of John's mercenary groups, the captains of these groups being Fawkes de Brute, John Stewart, we've met him before, Walter Buch from Brambacon, Gérard de Sontigny from Flanders, and Séverac de Mouillon from Poitou. Highly controversial foreigners, as far as people were concerned, that are running roughshod over English soil. A quick note on Mouillon. He was originally a supporter of Arthur of Brittany. He fought at Mirabeau and was captured by John. Unlike the rest of the garrison, John had them all starved to death, but Mouillon apparently escaped when his jailers got drunk. From then, he became a staunch, loyal supporter of King John, being made the Seneschal of Poitou. He was also part of the fleet, destroyed by Longsby at the Battle of the Dam. The irony. Like I said before, don't think these mercenaries as a band of peasants who could fight. They were mostly aristocracy, with all the training and all the equipment. These were knights. Knights who sold their swords to anyone with coin. Not all knights were born equally. You're a knight renting land? That big glass ceiling above you? Then find someone who doesn't mind hiring you and your band of like-minded individuals. Business is business. Anyway, back to the situation in the south of England. Here, Longsby and the mercenaries are ravaging the areas surrounding London, including Essex. They're pushing on to Pleshy Castle. Young Geoffrey de Mandeville, yes, the one screwed over by John's excessive 20,000 mark inheritance tax, is under siege on Christmas Day. What a devil. John's mercenaries worth every penny. Even our chronicler, Ralph of Coggeshal, wasn't safe. His own abbey was raided by Potivar mercenaries on New Year's Day. They stole the horses. Deplorable behaviour. Another chronicler explains the king's Flemish mercenaries in the north going about with swords drawn, ransacking houses, cemeteries, robbing everyone. They put villages to the torch and didn't even spare the women and children. During all of this, Fulks de Brute captures several castles, including Bedford, a castle he'll hold for a very long time. He's also taken lands from William Modwy. He'll also marry Margaret de Rivers. He has gone from an insignificant bastard child of a minor noble to a brutal mercenary captain. Over the years, he's risen to the steward of King John, loyal to the last. You've most certainly heard of him, or at least his legacy, for his hall in London was called Fulks Hall, which became Foxhall, and we know it today as Vauxhall. Which leads me to his heraldry, as I use his Cinquefoil heraldry here, but only because that's the one used by Matthew Paris, a chronicler contemporary to his time. But it is widely known that Fulks used a griffin, and knights changed their heraldry more often than you think. The royal army was described as the limbs of the devil, locusts that harried the north. Not since the days of King Stephen 70 years ago had the kingdom seen such barbaric behaviour. Wendover describes the horror in detail. Everywhere is mourning and everywhere is misery. Bishops are banished and a large multitude of refugees are scattered in the wake of these fleeing priests. Stephen Langton, the one man who could get John to see reason, has been removed from office, and Wendover blames the Pope's reaction to Magna Carta and the subsequent excommunications as having been deceived by King John. He wasn't wrong. These were dark days indeed. People were brutally tortured, imprisoned, huge fines given. D'Albany's castle at Beauvoir was forced to surrender or be starved to death. The same went for Pontefract. And this wasn't at all one-sided. Only a short while ago, some rebels had left London, capturing Cambridge and dragging off captives in chains back to the metropolis. The barons rampaged through Norfolk and Suffolk, laying it to waste. Even Colchester wasn't spared. There were no saints in this conflict. Soon John was in York. To the dismay of the terrified citizens, they offered £1,000 and begged to be spared to the wrath of his troops. The rebel barons, having fled north to ally with the Scottish King Alexander, leaving the denizens of York to it. They torched their own lands to defy the king everything. Leave nothing for the devil. The rebel barons were not quitting. They were waiting for Louis. They had sent Sire de Quincy, an English baron who was in France currently treating with the French king. But Louis, in return, had only sent 114 knights, and this contingent headed straight for London. Louis himself would not arrive till Easter. Meanwhile in the south, said Sire de Quincy arrives with 40 ships from France. a lot of soldiers to bolster the rebel cause. They headed to Colchester to raise the siege, but spent most of the time in London, more intent to drink wine by the barrel than fight. Unfortunately, the young Geoffrey de Mandeville was accidentally slain in a tournament in February, killed by a French knight. John's war machine is still at York, but he hears that Alexander has razed Newcastle. The city was on fire. Livid, John vows to run the little fox cub into the ground, leaving York and heading to Scotland, taking Berwick upon Tweed by mid-January. He then pressed into Scotland, burning Haddington, Dunbar, razing the abbey at Coggeshal. This wasn't an invasion, but a message. A week later, John returned to England, setting fire Berwick as he went. It is said he burned his lodgings personally with his own hand. By now, John had spent so long in the north that rumours of his death began to circulate. So in March 1216, he marches south into East Anglia. Framlingham Castle then fell, another rebel defeated, then Colchester. The 25 were dwindling. Around this time, King Alexander is attacking Carlisle, and the northern barons laid siege to York. It was a game of cat and mouse. As March was coming to a close, John had crushed the east, and at Gillingham he shared the spoils of war with his mercenaries, like a biblical tyrant of old, and no doubt eagerly counting his coins like a 1930s villain. Now they'd seen their coin, the mercenaries were more than eager to press on to London, the last bastion of defiance. The forces at London promised to meet John on the field, should he come within 10 leagues. He did, at the end of March, just 12 miles away at Enfield. This sparks a skirmish, where the commander of the Poitevin mercenaries was injured, Severic de Mouillon. Others were killed. The barons were not beaten yet. The king sends ships up to the Thames to blockade, but the forces at London beat them back. Many mercenaries drowned in the fray. This forces John to retreat back to Reading by the 5th of April. London still belongs to the rebels, but Louis is nowhere to be seen, and Easter passes. Around this time, I'll add that Fawkes de Brou had laid waste to the diocese of Ely, ransacking the cathedral there, apparently while on horseback and sword drawn. He took some clergy prisoners, including Stephen Riddell, a respected local figure. Meanwhile, John is up to his usual tricks of deceit. The king, not wishing to fight the French, does two things. Firstly, re-excommunicates the rebel barons, naming each and every one of them. Not that this would accomplish much, but probably made John feel a little bit better. Then he sends a letter to the King of France, with the seals of all the rebel barons. A total forgery that had the intention of misleading Philip to believe that the rebels no longer needed Prince Louis's help in England, and everything was under control. They still had that 5-year truce, but Capitan Philip Augustus has no intention of doing so. Once again, Pope Innocent III gets involved. He sends another legate to France, the Cardinal, the other man in red on a white horse, Guala Bicchieri, to sort the problem out. The Pope had no care for this Barons' War. He had a crusade to conduct, the 5th Crusade. This was all getting in the way of it. While John's envoys were rejected, Louis was taken seriously. He had a valid claim to the English throne. According to the French, John forfeited the crown when he murdered the young Arthur of Brittany. All John could do was prepare for yet another invasion. He had no other choice, but unlike before, most of his barons were against him. On the 12th of April, at Reading, John, in desperation, tries a treaty with Eustace de Vesey. Of all people. Eustace told him exactly where to go. So John turns to the navy. Deal with Louis before he arrives, just like they did at the Battle of the Dam. At the end of April, John is in Kent, then in Folkestone in May, no doubt looking for French sails. Before long he was in Dover. Once again he sends his ships to burn the French while they are at port. Alas, on the 18th of May, there was a terrible storm, wrecking John's fleet. England was at the mercy of the French. Louis was ready to invade, and this he did, aiming to join with the forces in London. With them was the Papal legate, Guarda though Louis was a bit too eager and ran foul of the same storm. It blew him off course, depositing him at Sandal. Here he only had a few troops. His army was scattered. Tables turned once again, this time in John's favour, and John was only up the road in Canterbury. Here John was awaiting the reception of Guarda. There would be no counterstrike. He would play the good boy. But the papal ship was blown off course, so John takes a cheeky peek at Louis's forces. He heads to Sandwich. To Sandwich, not for a sandwich. Not been invented yet. It'll be several hundred years before a certain earl has the genius idea of putting things between bread and creating said sandwich. The same earl, member of the Hellfire Club, who sponsored Captain Cook and named the Sandwich Isles. But yeah, this is where it happened. Louis hadn't come for a sandwich either. His mind was on conquest. He was calling himself the King of England, and few questioned him. And John's army awaited French invasion with trepidation. Only he wouldn't fight them here on the beaches. Most of his army was foreign mercenaries, many French, loyal to Philip. Sure, they'd happily fight the barons, but fight the Dauphin and the French royal family? Their allegiance was France. Many men on the shore had friends and family on those very ships, and coin could only buy so much loyalty. William Marshall suggests a tactical retreat. John then slipped off to Dover, apparently deserting his mercenaries, and soon he was in Winchester. So Louis took Sandwich. Canterbury retook Rochester Castle. On the 7th of June he's in London, celebrating victory, and led into St Paul's Cathedral in a great procession. His men billeted out of the city, emptying the wine cellars. And here at the capital, Louis met Robert Fitzwater. The barons were still in the game, and John was on the run. After 3 days of celebration, Louis gathered his forces and rode off to Winchester in pursuit of the defeated English king. On the way, taken Reigate, Guildford, Farnham. There was no stopping the French. On the 14th of June, the walls of Winchester Castle were in sight of the French. But John had already fled to Corfe Castle. Who was left in charge of Winchester? The Poitevin mercenary commander, Sir Varick de Mouillon. He'd actually proven loyal, burning some of the city while fighting his countrymen. Towards the end, de Mouillon fled, catching up with John, before getting permission to return, with the orders to surrender. And Winchester falls to Louis. John was all but defeated, holed up in Corfe Castle with only his personal retinue, his most loyal, and the crown. He was denying Louis everything. He had sacred relics, anything he could get his hands on. John had lost everything but the crown. He'd lost the south. London was now under French occupation, along with the treasury. Canterbury, along with the archbishop. Now Winchester, effectively a second capital. All that stood was the north, and aside from a loyal few, it was held by his enemies, and Eustace de Vesey still held York. Further north, in Scotland, he had no friends. Young Alexander, in his teens, had grown up a hostage. He had nothing but resentment for John. He hated him. The baronial rebels were emboldened by Louis's blitz across England. They flocked to his banner, including many of John's loyal knights. Surrey, Arundel. The hardest blow was William Longsby, who also bent the knee to the Dauphin of France, Louis the Lion. The English king could see his kingdom collapsing all around him. John had even sent writs to all that stayed loyal. One command only: hold your castles. If not, destroy them. It was the beginning of the end. It was over. Check. But not mate. He wasn't prepared to topple his peace just yet. But he only had prayers. Prayers that were answered. Oddly, Louis doesn't press on to Dorset to face the clearly defeated king. He doesn't besiege Corfe Castle. Instead, he doubles back and heads for Porchester, taking the castle there. John probably couldn't believe his luck. Deus ex machina. Fate had played her card. Louis then heads north to take a castle in Odiham. What was he playing at? He was snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. He had England in his hands, if only for a brief moment in time. It was most likely squabbles breaking out between the French. Like the Norman English, they were also fractured, demanding spoils, having personal agendas. They also clashed with the baronial rebels. 1066, where William the Conqueror replaced all the Saxon nobility with his Norman friends? Louis was doing the same here. That's what's occurring. But this time the barons were having none of it. They pushed back. They were keeping their lands, bugger the French. 2 fingers and all. Add to this, John would only retreat further west, and Louis didn't plan on following John on a merry chase across Cornwall. John could easily slip to the coast and vanish again. Oh, and Odiham? It was an easy target, only held out by 13 men, and Louis needed castles. Still, this little puppy held out for a whole week. Apparently even Louis was quite impressed. Then the Dauphin heads again for London. From there, he sends a battle to lay leaguer to Windsor, while his own forces headed for Dover, a mighty fortress that had held up against the rebels. Then, from Corfe, John moves himself out of check. He heads north, through Bristol, then Gloucester, Hereford, and there he remained for the rest of July. And by north, I mean northwards, not the north. Basically, John's relying on the west. Not just the West Country, but the Martial Lords and the Welsh, the Irish. Ranulph de Blondeville and the Marshal are still staunch allies. John travels to Shrewsbury, Whitchurch, Worcester. Out of check, he's planning one last roll of the dice, one last hurrah. Here, he would stage his defence. On August the 19th, he sent letters rallying his supporters. This is where he predicted Louis would strike. The West. But John was wrong. As Louis was in a bit of a pickle. He'd just spent 3 weeks laying leaguer to Dover Castle, and it wasn't budging an inch. Pretty much halted the whole invasion. Castle? What an understatement. Dover Castle is a fortress, built by Henry II, impregnable. Hubert de Burgh held fort, with more than a competent garrison, and Louis was no John. There was no way in a million years he was going to break the defenders, even given 1,000 pigs. I'm not saying Louis was useless. His father broke the cheeky castle at Gaillard. and the Dauphin had established extensive siege works at Dover. Erecting buildings around it, he practically built a village. His fleet cut off the port. He brought the heaviest artillery of the age. For 3 weeks he battered the walls, but they stood firm. But unlike John at Rochester, Louis wasn't facing 100 desperate men. He was facing a well-oiled army, and they were shredding his men. Losses were taking their toll. Many French cut their losses and simply deserted, heading back for France. Some had done so before the siege even began. The situation got even worse thanks to a small faction of longbowmen led by a chap known as Willikin of the Weald,
Hooray!
aka William of Keynsham. Yes, blokes in the woods, playing a guerrilla war. They do appear in the history books contemporary to King John, though Willikin of the Weald is fighting for John, not against. He's depleting Louis's forces, and it would be tantalising to think that these led something to the legends of Robin Hood. A band of men in the woods, playing cat and mouse with the nobility, armed with longbows, and led by a possible noble of sorts, lovable scallywags and heroes of the story. John even wrote a letter to them, thanking them for their efforts. So, with Louis tied up in Kent, John strikes. No sooner had September begun, John had rallied all the support he could, and advancing headlong into Windsor, where the garrison had held up against the invading French. John didn't break the leaguer. Instead, he sent Welsh longbowmen forth, who sent arrows into the enemy camp at night. There was no room for honour here, nor chivalry. The kingdom was at stake. The gloves were off. And when the French readied for battle, John fled, most likely trying to lure away the besiegers, a feigned flight. Though, in his absence, the rebels, led by Robert Fitzwalter, struck, taking castles from John as he went. So the king raced from Sonning to Cambridge in 3 days, intending to take them back. From Cambridge to the borders of Suffolk and Essex, he was heading them, no doubt seeing if the Lord was still loyal. And John burnt everything as he went. He arrived at Hereford, the domain of de Clare. More destruction, gradually heading north to where Alexander of Scotland was proving a right pain in the arse. But Alexander was a bigger pain in the backside than John had thought. He'd travelled south, via the east of the Isle, arriving in Kent, bending the knee to Louis, and no doubt enjoying good French wine. John pressed on. He'd get the little bugger on his return journey. But unfortunately for John, his feigned flight worked rather convincingly for the French. They were indeed in hot pursuit. They were not seeing his tactics as fighting Fitzwalter's rebels, but in full flight, en route. They were poised to take Cambridge. John's cut off from the south. He heads north, reaching Lincolnshire. He went with a scorched earth policy, burning barns, religious buildings, fields of unharvested crops, everything. He reached Lincoln to an old ally, the aged Nicola de la Haye, the widow who held Lincoln Castle that was currently under siege by the baronial rebels. John drove them off, driving them to the Isle of Axon, where they were obliterated. The survivors joined Louis in Dover. But in doing this, the young Alexander slipped away back to Scotland. John had missed his chance. John was laying Lincolnshire coast to ruin. The chroniclers are appalled. Fires are seen all over the land, nothing to be proud of. He was hoping to get supplies to reinforce his castles in the north, the few that remained loyal. On October the 9th, he was in King's Lynn, Norfolk, but alas, he fell ill. Ralph of Coggeshal claims it was dysentery.
caused by an excess of food and drink. Wendover corroborates this, adding peaches and strong cider to the excess. But John had been on the march and must have been physically and mentally exhausted by now, often riding 30 miles in a day. John must have been comfort eating, binge drinking, brought on by stress. He was only in King's Lynn for 2 days, even though he was ill, heading out. Ever determined to cut his journey and save time, he heads across the Wash, a tidal estuary where the River Wellstream met the sea. Here, John's luck runs out. Fate collected her debt. The house always wins. As John and his entourage crossed, the baggage train was sucked down into the lands. Horses, people, sacred relics, the crown. John had lost the crown. Literally, not figuratively. Items that history abandons, never to be seen again. John arrives in Swineshead, Lincolnshire, and after a short rest of 2 days, the illness passes. Still he pushed on to Slifford. There he learned that Lewis had undermined the port of Dover Castle. Hubert de Burgh was fighting the long defeat. Only a truce held the fortress. De Burgh should seek the king's aid or surrender. The news hit John hard. The king was a defeated and broken man. Another reminder of the past, like Scrooge's ghosts. This was his father's fate, and the illness had returned. Even bleeding him came to no avail. This time it was serious. On the 15th of October, he wrote a letter to the Pope. He explained that he had suffered from a grave and incurable infirmity. Alas, Pope Innocent III had also been stricken with illness, and he died on July the 16th. Now Honorius III was in his place. Hang on, give him long hair, long black hair, and facial hair? It's the Metatron. I recognise that mouth and nose anywhere. Carry on. John places the kingdom in the church's protection and leaves it at that. The king clearly never saw his sons, the 9-year-old Henry or his younger brother Richard, inheriting the kingdom. It was over. Broken, ill, defeated, carried on a litter. The king made his 20 miles to Newark, a castle confiscated from the Bishop of Lincoln. Here John writes his last will and testament. Here he assigns administration of his affairs to his most loyal: William Marshall, Peter Roche, Ranulph de Blonville, and the indifferent papal legate, Guala Bicchieri. They were to make amends to the church, aid to be sent to the Holy Land. What's more, secure the inheritance for the royal sons, who remained at Corfe Castle with their mother, Isabella of Angoulême. Habitat ruinum. Isabella and her poor boys must have seen nothing but doom for themselves as the kingdom fell apart around them. As for the will, the repentant king made sure the executors of said will would be rewarded, and then distribute coin to the religious houses in order to save his eternal soul. He also made another repentant wish, the wish that Margaret, wife of Walter de Lacy, would found a religious house in Herefordshire in the name of her father, William de Broas, and her mother Matilda, and brother William. At death, Arthur of Brittany still bored into the guilty soul of John, and the original copy of this document survives. On the night of the 18th of October, a great wind howled through the castle of Newark, howled through the town. The denizens were worried. Meanwhile, Adam, the abbot of Croxton, made his way through this, headed for the castle. John was dying. He wouldn't make it through the night. So here the abbot gave John his sacrament of anointing the sick, the last rites. The king was beyond medicine now. He was in God's hands. And thus he parted his last breath. The prophecy of the hermit complete. It just took slightly longer than predicted. The next morning, the king's body was prepared for burial. His body was cut open, and his heart and intestines removed and buried at the local abbey at Croxton, a normal practice for the era. The body itself was embalmed with intention to be buried at Bellew, Hampshire. Remember the quarrel with the Cistercians? John had held up his end of the bargain to be buried there. Alas, it was enemy territory. As was Normandy, he would not be buried with his father, brother and mother. Instead, he was interred at Worcester Cathedral, one of the last places with royal support where they could guarantee a safe funeral. Escorted by his foreign mercenaries, serving him right until the end. William Marshal was there. It was a magnificent service, full of regal splendour. John broke a tradition, the first in a long line not to be buried with a crown. Remember that kings had multiple crowns in this period, but in his case, all were lost in the wash. Instead, he was buried with a humble linen coif, the one worn to hold the crown in place at his coronation. He also broke another tradition, as on his tomb his sword is unsheathed and ready for war, digging into the throat of a lion beneath his feet. It is said the lion represents England and all that opposed him, but could just as easily represent his adversary, Louis the Lion, the Dauphin, who John was at war with, and as far as John was concerned, he had won. Alas, we may never know. His tomb would also have been painted and clad in jewels, but unfortunately this was stripped during the Reformation era. King John was little mourned. Only William Marshal really showed any signs of grief, and that's according to his histories. The majority pondered about what torments of hell John was suffering. To say he was disliked was an understatement. As foul as hell is, it was made fouler by the presence of King John. On his death, he was only 49 years old. So there we have it. The life of the infamous king. From the landless young boy destined to be an oblate in the church to the tyrannical autocrat made famous in our media. He saw his brothers die one by one and outlived many enemies. Yet, I am not here to judge old John. That is not my place. We cannot judge the past through our own modern lens. The past is a foreign place, and people did things differently there. I can only compare him to other kings, contemporary to his time. So was John really that bad a king? He was most definitely a tyrant who suffered from an uncontrollable rage, but so did his brother, his father, and his descendants. It's known as the Plantagenet rage. He didn't brutally beat up the woman that turned down his hand in marriage like William the Conqueror did, nor did he have the Archbishop of Canterbury slain at the altar of the cathedral, like his father did, allegedly. Sure, he tried to usurp the throne, but his brother Richard was equally a tyrant who used England as a cash cow to fund his wars, plus the extortionate amount of money raised to pay Richard's ransom. you can understand why John did what he did, at least here. In many cases, it was just. In others, cruel and evil. Others, he was clearly on a power trip, like with Stephen Langton, all those years of interdict and church looting. Clearly a psychopath who starved people without trial. He burned villages and towns. But it was no different from any other king of the era, to be brutally honest. Wales, Scotland and Ireland was already a powder keg waiting to blow by the time John inherited the throne. His brother Richard had already taxed the kingdom to oblivion and paved the way for the loss of the continent. Remember, John made peace with the Welsh, and Richard rejected it. And John was no soldier, nor was he a good politician. My opinion is the Magna Carta was inevitable. Should Richard had survived his campaign in France, he planned to return to the Holy Land, more taxes, his milk in England dry. Would he have suffered Magna Carta? And inflation hit John. He inherited his brother's mess. Yet despite all of this, his rival, Philip of France, he paid even more than John. Maybe the Magna Carta would still have been written, and there's no way Richard would have signed it. Oh no, he also had a reputation for brutal retribution, and Fawkes de Brew and Savaric de Mouillon were nothing like Mercedier, Richard's own mercenary captain, who is said to have flayed people alive. Did the barons dodge a bullet by having to deal with John, the soft sword, and not the crusading brother? Either way you look at it, John was by no means a good ruler. But he was never supposed to be. He was the little boy destined to be an oblate in the church, thrust into the echelons of power and higher intrigue. And even when St. Hugh tried to warn him about hell at Fontevraud, John was clearly just playing around, pushing the boundaries. He was no deliberate sinner seeking hell. Mercurial, he'll have mood swings and mind changes. You couldn't predict him. For me, this is my main judgment. As I said before, it's like Joe Pesci from Goodfellas. He could turn on you at the drop of a hat, unpredictable to the last, preferring to lie rather than tell the truth. Remember with William Marshall claiming that his men were dead when they weren't. Pretty much a dick move. Even some of his most loyal threw him under the bus, including his mercenary captains. And his sexual appetite was atypical of the era, preferring to bed the wives of his loyal barons. It lost him many allies. Even his wife never mentions him again. He often influenced cruel punishments that he later regretted, like starving people to death, which he was fond of. It wasn't just Matilda de Broas. There were many others, including all those captured at Maribou. And as for Arthur, only a handful of people ever knew the truth. Outside of de Broas's wife Matilda, history falls silent. People took it to their graves. But John's personal guilt is reflected in his will. He was a repentant man at the end. He often gave alms to the poor to atone for various breaches of fasting. He spent lavishly and offered great hospitality, showering people with gifts. Being king was never his responsibility. He, in my opinion, was trying his best to play with the hand dealt. And he was dealt a very bad hand indeed. A great but unlucky prince. And once his funeral was over, the realm descended into chaos. This civil war was far from over. But that is another story. Thank you for watching.